Hi, this is Mark Arnold with another episode of Fun Ideas Podcast, and today we have another person from Marvel Comics. This is because Mark Slade and I are working on a book about Crazy Magazine, but we're going to talk about a little other things than just crazy. And today's guest is Scott Edelman. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing fine. um, So I guess the inevitable question I always ask people when they first start is just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into Marvel and or how you got interested in the comic book industry.
Well, we can start with just taking note of one important date. We are just a couple of days away from the 50th anniversary of the first day I started Marvel Comics. I started on June 24th, 1974. So Monday was the 50th anniversary of that date. So I was quite high because it's hard to believe it's that long. Obviously, my love of comics went back much further than that. I can't remember a time when comics were not a part of my life, even before I had any money with which to buy them. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York.
Mhm.
Luckily, not that far away, just a subway token away from 575 Madison Avenue, where I would someday go to work. And all the kids would just gather on the front stoops of the apartment buildings, wherever it happened to be, or at the beach, and just be trading comics with each other. So I was lucky enough to see comic books from long before I would have been able to buy comic books because I was born in 1955, and yet I have a definite memory of reading the first Flash that came out in Showcase #4. That would have been 1956. I would have been a year old. There's no way I would have bought that, but people were passing around coverless comics, and I just love them. There was never a time I didn't have them. I was just exactly the right age to become a Marvel comic in that born in 1955 means 1961, the first Fantastic Four comes out. I'm 6 years old, so it's a perfect timing for that to fall under the sway of Stan and Jack and everybody who was there. So I remember all that. I remember only having enough money in my pocket to buy a single comic the day X-Men #1 and Avengers #1 went on sale at the same time, and having to decide which one to buy between the two. I eventually got both, but the one I bought was Avengers #1 because given the choice between who are these X-Men I never heard of, and here's a comic with the Hulk and Iron Man and Thor and everybody you know in it, you go with that. But so it all started from there, and I luckily enough lived in New York. So when I heard there were comic book conventions in New York, those first ones that were happening back then, San Diego Comic Con, I guess, started in 1970 on the other coast, and
Mhm.
uh, the Scarp cons happened. And so the first con I ever went to, age 15,
Mhm.
was the 4th of July Phil Seuling conventions you might have heard about.
Oh yeah.
And so I showed up at age 15, never thinking I'd work in comics, just as a fan, and small compared to what conventions became, several hundred people, maybe I think there may be 500 people altogether. And some of the people I remember meeting, Joe Sinnott, who was at the time I thought was the world's greatest thinker and the best thinker of Jack Kirby, and Vic Giordano and Sergio Aragones. And I remember those because I have all their autographs that I got back then. I still have
Very
the
cool.
program book. And from living in New York, I mean, the way I got my job at Marvel Comics, it was a complete accident. I wasn't planning to work in comics. I was planning to be a journalist, go to school for journalism at the time, and went to the State University of Newark at Buffalo. And it so happened that a big name comic book fan named Duffy Volan moved into my neighborhood. He wrote for all the fanzines. If you're familiar with any of the old time fan, he was an inker also. He wrote a column called Duffy's Tavern for fanzines at the time, which took off on a radio show from the 30s and 40s. So
Right.
that goes way back. But that was what he called his column. Anyway, he moved into my neighborhood and we met by accident. This is a long, involved story, so I don't know which time you got here, but I'm taking you through the whole origin story.
That's
But
fine.
I guess he moved into the neighborhood that I was in, which was Georgetown in Brooklyn, and some kids saw him unpacking boxes that were labeled, Strange Tales number 140, whatever. And the kids said, "Hey, there's some other guy in this neighborhood who also collects comics." And one day the doorbell rings, and it's Duffy Voland, and he had come to New York to start working in comics, begin working there. And I was actually offered a job in the comic book industry. I mean, I was hanging out at all these conventions in 70, 71, 72, 73, getting sketches from people. So I have sketches from all the people starting out then, being friends with them, hang out with them. Never tried to get a job in comics because I thought that if you want something out of someone, they see you as a shark. Oh, he's only hanging out with me because he hopes I'll get work. So I never asked anybody for anything. And then one day, Tony Isabella, who edited the British reprint comics for
Mhm.
Marvel, was moving off to work on the black and white line of books, which included Crazy, but Dracula Lives, Monsters Unleashed, all those comics, and they needed someone to edit the British reprint books. So through Duffy, they said, "Hey, would you like to apply for this job?" And I did, and I got hired. And the way I applied for the job was to the British reprint books had their own bullpen bulletins pages based on what the comics that were coming out in the UK were. And they did not publish full comics back then. The British comics, if you've ever seen a British comic, they wouldn't just have a 25-page story. They would have like 4 or 5 or 6 page stories in an issue. So I
Mhm.
had to cut up American comic books into chunks and have 5 pages of the Hulk and 5 pages of the FF and 5 pages of Spidey. And when you did page 6 through 10 of an American book, it needed a new splash page. So you had to write a new splash page to go with that second chapter. Really weird what they did over there. And so I had to write a couple of fake splash pages and write a bullpen bullets page. And I guess I passed the test and I got hired. And 50 years ago, 2 days ago, as we're speaking, I was hired to show up at 575 Madison Avenue on the 6th floor and work for Marvel Comics back in the old days when Stan Lee was still there every day. He hadn't gone to California yet. And, he was in the corner office. We saw him all the time. And all of a sudden, I was just surrounded by all these people who I never wanted to leave. We would just sort of live in the office and, play softball and volleyball together. We go to the movies every Friday night and so on. So that's sort of my origin story with how I ended up getting the job in Marvel Comics and worked through 6 editors in chief because there was a high turnover back then until Jim
Right.
Shooter came in and ended up having a long reign. But I was hired during the final days of Roy Thomas. And if I'm remembering correctly, it was Roy and then Len Wein and then Marv Wolfman and then Jerry Conway for, I think, 6 weeks and then Archie Goodwin and then Jim Shooter. I may be
Wow.
mixed up. I may be mixed up where Archie was there. I know Archie was there for quite a while, but then Jim, was there long past the time I was gone. So I actually had the experience of interacting, with all those people.
Wow. Now, you started off, you said, doing the foreign language editions, as it were, the British editions, you said. Uh,
Yeah, aside from
but
cutting up comics, you have to change color to color. You have to add OU and change theater to RE. And if Spider-Man had a baseball reference, you change it to cricket. It was very
wow.
bizarre. So if you look over, so that's basically what I started. I was there for about 5 months.
So, yeah, I was going to say, how long did you do that before? Because you've done other things. You were an assistant editor, and it says on your website you're writing everything from display copy to the superhero Slurpee cups and the bullpen bulletins, and all stuff. What did those duties entail?
Well, everybody sort of got to do a little bit of everything. If you wanted to do something and you found yourself capable of doing something, they let you do it. And when I was in the British section, I basically kept my nose to what was going on with the UK reprints and using my infinite knowledge of every single Marvel comic that had been published from 1961 until 1974 to do those reprints. But when the job became open, and I'm trying to remember exactly whose position I took over there in order to get in. I can't remember who moved on. Basically, it was all musical chairs as things moved around. I
Well,
don't know if someone else.
Wasn't it Tony himself? Because we interviewed Tony Isabella as well, and I think he did that for a time. Maybe
Well,
not
he was
directly
doing
before you. Yeah,
right. He was doing the British books. So my initial hire was because he moved from the British books to the black and
right,
white books.
right.
But then someone had to leave the US department to allow a slot from it might have just been we were expanding because
Yeah,
that was a period when there was a giant explosion of titles. And
yeah,
I moved into the regular bullpen.
yeah.
In fact, I took over Marv Wolfman's desk after those 5 or 6 months and I started working on the U.S. books. And that working on the U.S. books initially simply meant you showed up, they dumped original artwork in front of you. So I was sitting there with the full pages of the originals and a blue pencil and reading them, proofreading them, and pointing out, oh, you forgot to put the webbing under Spider-Man's arm here, or the wings are too high on the Submariner's ankle, or whatever it
Hmm.
happens to be. The belt buckle, someone's belt buckle is wrong, or what they're down below and it says, oh, that happened in issue number 43, True Believer. You know, it happened in issue number 27, which you would know because you had all the comics memorized because you were that kind of a Marvel fanboy. And that's what I would do. I would sit there all day and, I don't know how many I would get through in a single day, but I would, take the pages and go back to the other part. I was in the editorial bullpen, and then you go to the art bullpen and go to someone like, Mike Esposito or Jack Abel or Frank Giacoia and say, fix the artwork. Or you would go to one of the letterers who were back there, whether it would be Maury Kuramoto or Rick Parker, or I can't remember everyone who was in there. I have to close my eyes and think about where everyone was, and they would fix the things, and you would mark off that they've been done, and when they were all done, you would give them to John Verporten, who was the production manager, making sure the books would go out on time, which they so rarely did. We had back then the triple D, the dreaded deadline doom that was often spoken about. And I remember that I was proofreading a comic and John Verporten just came and took it away from me. And and I said, well, I haven't finished reading it yet. He said, you'll read it when it comes out because the books were so late and we were getting charged so many $100 a day
Oh.
that often we were not able to read them. So that's why sometimes they come out. I mean, another thing he once said, he walked into the bullpen and said something like, our printer called. He's wondering if we're still in business
Wow.
because we were so late in a very dry, joking manner. But so that was the main part of the job. But if they saw that you could do anything else, I got to edit the fan magazine Foom,
Okay. I
and
was going to ask about
and
that.
the way I got to edit the Bullpen Bulletins page, Len Wein simply did not have time. He was just so busy trying to get those late books on time. And he
Hmm.
said, "Oh, would you give it a shot?" And so I wrote everything except Stan's soapbox. Stan still wrote the soapbox, and they liked what I did so much that
Hmm.
they said, "Okay, Scott, you're now writing these for the next couple of years." So for like the next 2.5 years, I wrote the Bullpen Bulletins pages. I would find out what we wanted to talk about and try to sound like Stan. It was basically the easiest thing I ever did in my life because if you were a kid mainlining Stanley's voice your entire life,
Yeah.
to to just spill it back up, then someone says, "Oh, give me 200 words talking about the Marvel value stamps," and boom, you've got all the alliteration and all the Stanisms that you could
Hmm.
possibly do. So I wrote that. If you remember the comics at the time for a while, this is something Tony Isabella did, and then I did when he stopped doing it. Was the bottom of the comics, they wanted to not waste any ad space. Sometimes you would see a typed sentence at the bottom of a comic book in a two-part. On the left hand, at the bottom of a page of any comic book, it would
Hmm.
say, "This month, Spidey's guest star is Human Torch," and on the right
Right.
hand, "Don't miss the blazing story in issue number whatever." And I would hand in 40 or 50 of those, and they would just type them. And as they got sent off to the printer, someone would paste them down. I did this 1 year of the Slurpee cups. Mine was the second year, I believe, the one that
Hmm.
had word balloons on them. So if you got the one with the word balloons on one side, I even did things like if a live Spider-Man was going to appear at a car dealership, sometimes the car dealership would phone in and I would pretend to be Spider-Man to be interviewed because the actor wouldn't know how to answer all the questions, but someone at the office, well, I wouldn't go to the car dealership. They had an
Well,
actor.
at that point, you didn't even have an actor. I mean, you did, but Spider-Man was on the electric company.
Well, they would
He's
hire a
silent.
model, just yeah, they would hire just a model to show up in a Spidey
Yeah,
suit
yeah,
and things like that.
yeah,
So there were all sorts of the half-page ads that would
yeah,
appear in the comics,
yeah.
and anything that needed to be done, they would get someone to do. Like someone I can't remember, maybe Dave Kraft did the calendars. I can't remember who did
Yeah.
what, but they're just all. I wrote letter pages because not every writer wanted to write the letter pages for a comic. They would hand you a sack of letters. You would go home, read the letters, pick three, write a couple of answers, and they would pay you $20. This was 1974 dollars. So you could go home and make more than you made on staff in a couple of nights' work. Like in an hour, you'd write three letter columns, and so you did very well with the freelance back then. And then eventually I started writing comics themselves because nobody was on there without people looking around saying, geez, we don't have enough people to do everything. Where you do something. And
Mm,
that's how I got my first thing. The first thing I did was The Scarecrow.
mm,
And then 19 that I wrote myself, and then eventually Captain Marvel was a series I did, and a
mm.
ton of those little 5 or 6 page backups that just show on comics because again, everyone's late. That's why
Right.
we got to do those. They figured if we had the main writer do a 15-page story instead of a 21, and someone else did a 5 or 6 page story, the lead story people would catch up and they wouldn't have to put a fill in, but they always had to put a fill in anyway. That's how Bill Manilow got so much work back then,
Yeah.
because they would use fill-in issues as threats that hey, if you don't hand in your book, we're going to mess up your continuity by throwing in a fill-in issue. So they got every single title would have a fill-in issue just sitting around, figuring, oh, they're never going to use these because the writer and artist will be so scared they don't want to mess up the continuity. They would stay on time, and they never did.
No,
And
they
that's how
use
I got
villains a
to
lot. I know.
that's how I got to do a fill-in for Master Kung Fu
Yeah.
and Omega the Unknown, and all sorts of things like that. So we had the benefit of they needed us a lot, whether our talent was there or not. So I point that out that in a better run, organized company where the talent, where they didn't triple the number of books they were putting out at the same time, they
Yeah.
wouldn't have needed us. If they could have done the books with the superstars who existed in the generation before us, they wouldn't have needed to expand. So
Yeah.
all the people of my generation had the benefit of that. So
Yeah.
I always say that it's not that I was a great writer. I had the knowledge and I
Yeah.
was jovial and fit in with the humor and the hijinks of the company.
Yeah.
But in terms of talent, I didn't know what the heck I was doing and needed them to show me, to teach me how to do what I wanted to do. So
Well, you
you'll get
you
a question in there every
you
once in a
you
while. I know you can ask me one
you
question, I'll
fooled
go on for half
you
an hour.
fooled
So
you fooled the 7-year old. I'm 57 now, so 50 years ago I was reading your stuff, and I thought it was gold. So I wasn't just reading Marvel. I read everything. So it's like I was reading
yeah,
that
well, then
as
eventually I went freelance and I
DC
worked for
and everything
DC.
else.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I
But
worked for I did a ton of House of Mystery, House of Secret
yeah,
stories, and
I was reading all your
Supergirl, and
stuff. So that's what,
Madame Xanadu, and
yeah.
all sorts of
Hmm.
fun things. So they needed a whole new generation of people simply because the comic industry was growing
Hmm.
so tremendously, even more so than it grew back when Marvel was only contractually allowed to do 10 titles a month back when I was a kid.
Hmm.
Back when when DC did the distribution, the company that distributed DC Comics was sort of a control. So when
Yeah,
first you had that giant explosion, when all the twin books turned into single books, Tales to Astonish and
yeah,
all that stuff, and then the '70s one, we had all those black and whites all of a sudden. They needed a lot of pages, so a lot
yeah.
of us ended up being able to get one. It was a lot of fun, but whether we deserved it or not, I don't know.
Now I didn't read everything because there was a lot of titles. So I
Oh, who
had
could
to.
afford it? I don't
Yeah, I
understand
mean,
how
if people go, "Oh, I wish comics were 25 cents again." They were expensive at 25 cents back then when you're a little kid. It's like, but
yeah,
I
and
kind of made, I,
the only reason
I
I could afford it when I was working at the companies was I got all the Marvel comics free, and you would find someone at DC
stacked like
Comics
this.
who wanted all the Marvel comics free, and you would give them all the Marvel free comics. They would give you all the DC free comics. So then basically all you had to do was buy Charlton and Gold Key and Archie if you wanted those as well. But luckily you could get a discount on that when you went to Ed Summer's Super Snipe comic. He gave a discount to any professional. So
Yeah,
it was cheaper for us back then. But
basically back then I just kind of did a round robin. I tended to buy Spider-Man more and things like that, but and Fantastic Four. But I'd say, oh, there's a title I've never bought before. I'll try that one, or something like that. Sometimes disappointed, sometimes not, but I tried a little of everything. So
I know you had to because of the days when you
yeah,
could get all of Marvel for $1 for the
no.
month. 10 cent comics will do you.
Well,
But
and I did buy all the other stuff too. I was buying Archie's and Harvey's and Dennis the Menace and all that stuff too. So it's like, only had so much money. So,
yeah,
um, So, I guess since we're supposed to be asking about Crazy Magazine, how did you fit into Crazy? What did you do there? I know you're friends with Steve Gerber and interviewed him at least once because we've seen that interview before. So tell us a little about your days at Crazy.
Well, my days at Crazy were, minimal compared to people like Larry Hama and Alan Coverberg and, all the people who really
Yeah.
spent a lot of time there. But I was in the office. It really was a communal situation where anybody who wanted to do anything could suggest anything to anybody. So there were very few closed doors. We saw Stan all the time. Steve was always wandering around the office. I had, wonderful times with Steve. He was a hilarious person to be around, and we would often do it, sort of guerrilla theater improv on the streets of New York together back when I remember I started working Marvel when I was 19 years old. And I just remember this one time, I don't know if we were coming from a movie or just one of those times we are all coming out for dinner. I threw myself down on the ground and started complaining to him that, Dad, please come home. Mom is so upset. Why did you leave the family? And he was dragging me along. I was holding on to his feet while he was walking like through Times Square and he was pulling me along, dragging me. No, leave me alone, kid, blah, blah, blah. Uh, and we were doing a lot of things like that. So I wrote, I know I wrote an ad for Crazy at one point. If you've ever seen the photo of Stanley burning money,
Oh yeah.
that was the inside front cover of a copy of Ad magazine. Because when I was writing ads for things, so I just, hey, I got a great idea for an ad for Crazy,
Hmm.
and so they took some photos of Stanley burning money because he thought that was hilarious. So and the main thing that got involved, I was involved with Crazy, the thing that most people look at and I get too much credit for because I think they wrote what I appeared for. There was a fake spoof ad that appeared on the inside front cover of an issue of Crazy that spoofed the dim Mac ads that used
Okay.
to appear, the where you could learn how to kill people with your bare hands.
Yeah.
And it was Count Dante who would appear in the upper left-hand corner of the ad, making these moves with his hands as if he was going to kill you. He was called known as the deadliest man alive.
Hmm.
And Crazy Steve decided he was going to spoof that ad
Yeah.
and decided who looks the wildest, who happened to be working at Marvel at the time. And at the time, I had a big gigantic Jufro, big wild curly hair. I had a big beard. I sort of looked like Rasputin, and I also had a bathrobe that looked like a gi that looked as if I knew kung fu. So they had me bring it into the office and make all sorts of deadly but ridiculous motions with that. One of which included me putting my thumbs in my ears and doing a wagga wagga wagga, with the rest of my hands, and they took all those photos, and he incorporated one of those into the ad on the inside front cover, and which I was called Count Dummy, Dumme, instead of Count Dim Mac, and no, yeah, I was Count Dummy instead of Count Dante, and he wrote all sorts of ridiculous copy that went with that.
Yeah.
That I don't believe is actually a credit as to who wrote it. So people keep
No.
thanking me for having written it, but all I did was get photographed for it. And
Okay.
I believe in the next issue or later on in the news column of the same issue, they might have done a story, an associated story that had Count Dummy was killed by a little girl in a wrestling match or something like that.
Well.
So he made the joke play out for more than one issue. But so my experience with Crazy was merely reading it and loving it and, loving the stuff that Lee Mars would do with the Moose and loving all the things he would get Marie Severin to do, particularly the Casper the Dead Baby that we all, love so much. It showed how Casper was really born. So my interactions with Steve were pretty minimal professionally, other than hang out with him a lot before and after the working day because nobody left anybody alone. It was very tight knit
Mhm.
back then. We would all be, hey, we're all going to go over to to Bernie Wrightson's house and then play volleyball in Queens, and just everybody would go, or we'd all be playing softball. Back in the days when movies only opened in one or two theaters in Manhattan, all you had to do on any Friday night is pick the screen that whatever the new movie was opening on, and you basically find every Marvel writer an artist there at the first show before or after dinner because they all needed to know I've got to steal from this, and I want to be the first one to do it.
Right.
uh, or do
Well,
a title that played off The Exorcist or whatever it happened to be. So,
so
so
I
yeah, so
actually
my, yep,
I actually had the ad here. Sorry to interrupt, but before we go on a different tangent, yeah, it's like there it is, and there you are, Buzzer.
Buzzark. Yeah, so that's
Yes,
what I look like basically 50 or 49 years ago. I can't remember if that's a 1975 issue. It might be a
I
1975
can tell
issue,
you which
but
one it is. It's number 12. It did come out in 75,
yeah.
August
So
cover
so
date.
that means
So
I'm 20 years old in that photo.
wow. And it's funny, Mark Slade. I think I always think I know everything about Crazy Magazine because I adored that magazine, which is why I'm writing the book. But Mark Slade said, "Ask him about the Buzz Zirk ad," and that didn't even occur to me that that was you.
No, that was me. And
Yeah.
I get far too much credit for it. It was written by Steve Gerber. It's hilarious. I've done a dramatic reading of it every once in a while.
Mhm.
And I'm just so it's strange to think that one of your proudest moments at Marvel Comics is something that all you did was pose and make weird expressions while I believe Michelle Wolfman was taking my photo for that. So she's the one who
Probably,
was the
yeah, yeah,
photographer.
yeah.
And the photos that were used actually I posted on my blog the raw photo, not as it appeared. And I think one of them you actually see a Marvel Comics This Way sign in the background. So to prove that they're actually taken at Marvel Comics. So
Mhm.
we'll have to make sure you look on my blog and get the copy of that if you're putting those in the book to see what they look like unphotoshopped. Well, now
Yeah,
I'm saying photo. There was no Photoshop in those days. People were using airbrushing,
yeah.
you know,
Well, we're having an index
to make
of
things
Crazy
happen.
Magazine, so I will be adding that Steve Gerber wrote it if I haven't already. I kind of suspected he wrote it, but
Yeah.
and I can
And
also
for some
mention.
reason, I believe I used that photo of me with my fingers in my ears that appears in the upper left-hand corner as my Facebook icon. So anytime it's not used as my main image, but it appears in that circle whenever I post. Perhaps someday I should put an image there that's a more recent photo than 50 years ago, but I love that image so much.
Just
Uh,
redo it now. Put a
yeah, go
fake
and take
beard.
the same, take the same thing to show what the years have done.
uh, so, when Gerber left Crazy, did you basically left Marvel by 1976 anyway. Was there a big turnover at that time? I know Gerber kind of went over to Howard the Duck because that was his baby, and Marv Wolfman was like doing the black and white magazines and stuff like that. So Crazy kind of went to other hands, Paul Lakin and stuff like that. So where were you in the middle of all this? What was going on?
Well, by that time, I would have been a freelancer working for both companies and not paid as much attention to what was happening in the field of crazy. At that time, I was continuing to do stuff at Marvel as a freelancer, but also pitching to people like Paul Levitz and Joe Orlando. I was beginning to write things like, well, I worked Welcome Back, Kotter for a while. That was my other humor
That's one thing you
stuff that I did
would.
over at Mar. That was probably one of the most fun jobs I ever had because I basically was a sweat hog. I grew up in the Brooklyn, New York City school system, so I knew who those people were, and I loved that TV show. So I wish that one had gone on, but I was going in and pitching for the war books that were
Hmm.
happening and writing weird war story. Usually the war stories that had a supernatural or science fictional element. But I was just writing
Hmm.
a ton of things for House of Mystery, House of Secrets, and also beginning my transition away from comic books because before getting that job in comic books, as I said, I never expected to work in comics.
Hmm.
I was working on my short stories, and then when I got a job in comics, I hadn't written any short stories for years because if someone says anything you hand in by Friday, we'll have a check for you on Monday, it's sort of tough to work on something that you may sell in 6 months or a year or not at all.
Hmm.
So I had to get out of comics. So in 1979, I applied to the Clarion Science Fiction Writing Workshop, which is a 6-week workshop that at the time was in East Lansing, Michigan,
Hmm.
that was trying to teach people how to write short stories better, that had professional writers come in one a week for 6 weeks. And I sort of wanted to use that as a defining point. So I think probably the last comic book credit I had was something like 1980 or 81
Okay.
at the end. I haven't done any comics since then, and since then I've mostly focused on my short fiction. So since 1981, I think I published my first short story, and I've published about 125 of them since then in a variety
Mm.
of markets, and sort of devoted my life to science fiction rather than comics since then. I worked for the Sci-Fi Channel for 13 years. Before that, I edited a magazine called Science Fiction Age for 8 or 9 years.
Mm.
So I sort of shifted over to that side of things. And though I have an interest in comics these days, I have my own podcast called Eating the Fantastic, and I've had some comic book guests on it. They've primarily been reminiscing with the people from the old days, like Jerry Conway and Paul Levitz and Marv Wolfman and Larry Lieber and people like that. So
Right.
I'm aware of some of what's going on in comics these days. I read anything Tom King publishes, the rights. I love Tom King stuff, but I am mostly in the world of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Because as you said, no one can afford to read all those comic books. I would
Right.
love to. If there were a library, I guess I should be paying the Marvel and DC Unlimited thing, so you could just sort of read everything that comes out. Though I think you have to wait 6 months till they all hit or something. I don't
I'm
know how
not
it works,
sure.
but
Yeah. I mean, the way
but
I am about comic books now, I honestly don't really read things that are current. I mean, they're reprinting the Marvel Masterworks in a smaller pocket size, and I'm buying those because they're fun and easy to read, and they're not as expensive. They're only like $15, $16. So, things like that. And you get like 6 issues. So that's where I'm reading Marvels now.
well,
And
that's how a
yeah,
lot of
yeah,
people are. I think
yeah,
I've got one right. Every once in a
yeah,
while, I get an email from Marvel saying, "We're mailing you a FedEx package." And I think, "Oh, okay, they're reprinting something of mine again."
yeah,
And I never know what it is
yeah.
because I eventually get paid for the reprint,
That's cool.
but but until it shows up, and it's sort of this delay. Like I get the thing and I get the money. So I've got something in this latest
Yeah.
Spider-Man. What is it? Volume 10 of the Epic collection because it reprints the story that I wrote that John Romita Jr. drew,
Mm.
which was his very first piece of comic book artwork, his
Oh
first
wow.
professional work, because no one would give him work. And I was so happy that he remembered that. When he moved from Marvel to DC, I remember there was a story in the New York Times when he took over Superman. I
Hmm.
forget how many years ago this was, 10, 15 years ago. He took
Hmm.
over Superman, and he mentioned in the interview with the New York Times that he got his start because of me, because everyone said, "Oh, we can't hire John Romita Jr. because that would be nepotism." But
Ah,
Scott Edelman said the only thing I hate more than nepotism is anti-nepotism, not giving someone a shot
yeah,
when they're capable and should have a shot.
yeah. I'm
So
talented. Yeah.
I wrote one of those 6-page backup stories that was published in a Spider-Man annual, where they go back to the coffee bean. It was called Chaos at the Coffee Bean, and that was the first thing that John Romita Jr. ever drew. And I was so happy that he got to do it, and that he had his chance, and that he had such an amazing career since then. But that's where it started. I can't remember whether it was Spidey annual number 8 or 10. I'm not remembering anymore off the top of my head. But anyway, so that was one of the things I ended up doing and was thrilled to have been a part of. It's just one of the things. So yeah, I get those reprint books as well normally.
Okay.
And I can't understand how people can afford them. Like the Master Kung Fu fill-in I did, I think it was $125
Well, I
for
don't
the
go for
hard.
those. I've seen them. Yeah, the big
I
omnibuses that
know,
are
yeah,
like a
yeah.
phone book. Yeah, and
Well,
they're
for the
hardback.
longest time, every single page I had ever written for Marvel Comics had been reprinted except my Master of Kung Fu story,
Oh yeah.
because the rights were owned by the Sax-Rohmer estate, who owned the rights to Fu Manchu. And
Yep.
it wasn't until Marvel finally arranged some kind of a deal that they put out those gigantic, I think, 6 volumes to do every issue of Master of Kung Fu. But
Yeah.
I guess somehow there are people who have the money to buy them, and I guess it's certainly less money than it would be to buy the actual issues at this point,
Yeah.
but I couldn't afford them.
You know, a friend of mine interviewed Doug Minch, and yeah, this is before those omnibuses came out, so he was bemoaning the fact that I can't read my thing in a nice volume. I have to continue to look at the old uh, 35 cent, 40 cent comic books,
Yeah, you need
But
basically when they
yeah,
sell you the reprints, they should send you a violet perfume so they smell like the old
yeah,
comic books instead of that new
right,
glossy paper doesn't smell
yeah,
right. But
right.
the other connection I think I should mention in terms of fill-in that relates to Steve Gerber is I wrote a fill-in issue for Omega the Unknown
Hmm.
that I feel guilty about after all these years. that Omega the Unknown was really his and Mary Screenis's creation, and they ended up getting behind on the deadline for whatever reason after all these years I can't remember. And Jim Shooter just took me to lunch, and I remember, is it Roger Stern or Roger Schleifer? I can't remember. Took the two of us to lunch and said, "Okay, the book's late. You're each writing a fill-in issue."
Hmm.
And which one of you? I got two artists who need work. I've got Jim Mooney and I've got Lee Elias. And Jim Mooney, for people of my generation, he drew Supergirl when I was a little kid,
Hmm.
and he drew Tommy Tomorrow, and he drew all sorts of things. Lee Elias drew Green Arrow when I was a kid. Way, we're talking a long time ago now.
Yeah.
And so I think we each did that split, saying, "Wow, I love that. I love Jim Mooney." So I asked him to do
Hmm.
my issue. But there's always I mean, they had a plan for it, and I don't know what I would have done years later, feeling the way I do now about creative rights and not wanting to, mess with someone else's ideas. So I always later on I ended up feeling bad. But when you're 20 years old and someone says you want to write something, sure, I'll write anything
Yeah. Yeah.
anyone offers me. It doesn't think to say, Steve, if you don't catch up, they're gonna have me write a book or somebody, and I'd hate for that to happen. I have no idea what I would have done with the feelings I have now, but I do sort of, even though I loved working with Jim Mooney for that issue, I do have, bad feelings about
Hmm.
the way that slighted Steve and Mary Screenis and
Hmm.
interfered with them seeing the thing that they created. To its conclusion. So I just want to put that out there. And on top of all that, I should point out everyone listening should take a grain of salt. Everything I'm saying. It's 50 years now uh, since all these
Yeah.
things happened. Maybe I'm right. Maybe I'm wrong. If
Yeah.
I've occasionally gone back. I found an interview that I did, and I posted it on my blog that I did in something like 1976 with a fanzine, and I hadn't read that interview. And then maybe 10 years ago, I dug up the interview, and it's like, really? I was going to do that? I don't remember that. So, like they were going to have me wrap up all the Scarecrow in a 6-page or 8-page backup feature. Or something. I don't remember anyone offering me to do that. So there's
Yeah.
a whole bunch of things that sometimes get lost in the midst of time. So if you compare some of what I'm saying with what I said in the past,
Yeah.
I wrote ethics columns for the Comics Journal at one point and tried to put down back, I think, in the mid 80s, some of my feelings about comic books after I was no longer writing comic books. Uh, and if what I'm saying now and what I'm saying then matches, who knows what's correct? It'll be up to your listeners and to future historians to sort through it all
Yeah.
at this point because it's tough. There was not no one. There was very little contemporaneous. I'm very glad that, as you said, I did interview Steve Gerber twice,
Hmm.
and though the audio is not really what it should be
Hmm.
because it was not meant to be listened to. It was meant so that I could write the news column for Foom magazine and report to our readers what was going on with the Defenders and what was going on for Crazy. At least it exists.
Yeah.
You can transcribe them. People can listen. I mean, and I don't. I have no ownership of the words. I mean, use all those words in the book that you want. I mean,
Yeah.
they're meant for the people who came after to have the history. So there's something contemporaneous when
Yeah.
with Steve talking about what he felt was wrong with Marvel, and well, not wrong, what he thought was wrong with Mad versus what he wanted to do with Crazy.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that exists. Unfortunately, all the other interviews I did at the time were either lost or taped over.
Oh.
Um, I found some old tape. I'm thrilled that I found the interview I did with it was George Carlin back in the
Mm.
early 80s when I was probably only 17 years old, 17 or 18 years old. So I got a George Carlin interview that I put up on YouTube. But those are at least talking about what people were actually thinking at the time, not what they think they were thinking at the time looking
Yeah.
back. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so I just put that grain of salt out there for anybody listening to this.
Hmm.
So
I'm just wondering, and I don't know this for a fact, but I have some interviews that myself that I've done that are like because they were done over the phone with a cassette recorder or something back in the days when technology wasn't as it is now. But I've heard and this might be a possibility for if you have an interview that sounds all muffled or bad or something, that it's a positive use of AI technology that you might be able to separate the surface noise and all that other stuff from the actual voice. And I haven't tested this out on a couple of my bad interviews, but uh, I did the final interview with voice actor Thurl Ravenscroft, I
Oh,
believe, at the be the
wow.
fine.
Neat.
But it's really quiet because he's and so fortunately I played it back like right after I did it and just kind of transcribed it basically from memory. You
Right, so you
know?
got the words, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I couldn't even hear him, and it's like you could hear me fine. It's like, and then what did you do? And then
I know, and
like,
particularly
ah,
with Thurl Ravenscroft, who, for people who don't know, was Tony the Tiger and
yeah,
many other things. You're expecting him to talk like this,
yeah,
and
and he was very quiet. Except he did do imitate Tony the Tiger at one point, and that came out crystal clear.
oh,
So
so
when he went,
brief. So when he forced himself for the
yeah,
moment,
and
yeah,
he went great, and it's like you can hear that fine. It's like why didn't you talk that way the whole time? But
yeah.
I
I mean,
couldn't tell when I was recording
wasn't he
it.
some of the ghosts in the haunted mansion also?
Oh yeah,
I
and we
think he did
talked about
that,
all
and
that stuff. If you ever want to see that interview, it's in that Hogan's Alley magazine from way back, probably about 20 years ago now. So that's
and
a
what a name is Thurl Ravenscroft. I
oh
mean,
yeah,
forget
yeah.
anything that he did or said. I mean, he's got the name of a supervillain or something. I mean, what a magnificent name.
So like I said, I was thinking of looking into AI technology for that. If I could recover it, man, I'd put that up on YouTube and say, wow, you can finally hear them. It's like, but I haven't tested it yet, so
Well, you can
we'll
make
see.
out the ones I put up with Steve, though you do have to strain a little bit,
Yeah,
so it's not perfect.
right.
Uh,
Strangely enough, Mark Slade wrote a couple questions here about Welcome Back, Kotter, so I will ask them because I actually bought that series too. um, he was wondering how you wrote it. What were your scripts based on the TV scripts, or was it completely original?
they were completely original. I had to come up with ideas, and I had to hit the editor, I believe the editor, though. Sometimes when you look at books, the editor whose name is on the books might be the editor who was editor when the book is published and not the editor when the work was done. So in my head, I remember all my conversations being with Joe Orlando. In the book, I think if you look at the splash page, one of them shows Larry Hama as an editor, but I don't remember working with Larry Hama. But I think that at the time I was doing all sorts of House of Mystery, House of Secrets, and I was so close in age to the Welcome Back Cotter people at the time I was still in my early 20s, I guess. Maybe these were happening in 78, 79. I'm not sure of the dates, but I was still in my early 20s. And I think they thought I was just another sweat hog.
Yeah.
I, my relationship with the TV show was just like the relationship with Marvel Comics that got me the job. I had seen every episode of the show and
Mhm.
and knew intuitively what each of the characters was and what they would say in any situation. So that is the easiest writing that you can ever do. Once you know
Mhm.
who a character is and you toss them in the situation, it's like improv. You just say what they would say, and you know what they would say. This is know
Mhm.
what Horshack and Epstein and Barber, Vinnie Barbarino, and all of them would say. I would just know that. So I would just come up with two with the concepts. One of them was invitation to a family reunion with all the other Cotters. And I think the other one was when Mr. Woodman was going to be named Principal of the Year or something, so he was on his best behavior. And the kids were all trying to piss him off and get him to explode the way Mr. Woodman always did. And basically, you would go in and pitch, I guess, the same way you would pitch to a TV show, only I was pitching to, in my memory, Joe Orlando. And as I said, my
Probably
memory
was.
might not be what
Well,
it should be.
it
And they'd
probably
say, "Oh
was. I
yeah."
think he was kind of overseeing everything. So
And I'm like,
yeah,
"Oh, that sounds like a good one,"
yeah,
and go ahead and write it. I only got to write 2 issues of it, and it may be that what happened was at that point that they wanted the people doing the TV show to do the comic as well, because I believe the issue after the issues I wrote was Mark Evanier.
yeah,
But I think there was only one more issue after the issues I wrote, and it
yeah,
was Mark's, and then the comic book got canceled.
yeah.
But I love doing it. And I guess one of the fun things about it also harkened back to the early days of DC Comics.
Hmm.
You go back far enough, you've got Jerry Lewis comics and Dean Martin comics and, Sergeant Bilko comics. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a whole, when I
Uh,
was a kid, that was just another, aside from the Funny Animal and the kid comics, there were the lights, Roy Rogers and all those things. So
mm,
to write a comic book based on a TV show, but not taking the scripts, just new adventures of the
yeah.
same people was a lot of fun, and it was fun. And those were complete scripts. All the stuff I did for DC for people who aren't aware of the probably anyone who's listening to your show probably is aware of the Marvel versus DC methods, but the Marvel method was you basically wrote the equivalent of a short story, and the artist pasted and broke it down and gave you artwork with the space left to put in word balloons, and then you went through hoping that it would make sense as drawn. So every once in a while, I had to say no, reverse those two panels, and they cut them out and switch them around. And for the DC, those were all complete scripts. So all the Welcome Back Cotters would have been complete scripts, page one, here's a picture, here are the word balloons. And that all went to, I think Bob Oskner drew both of
Yeah.
the issues I'd done, but they were
Were
a
your
lot of fun.
scripts handwritten or typed?
No, those are typed
Oh,
scripts.
okay.
No,
I didn't
no,
know
yeah,
how
I
formal
wasn't
it
trying
was.
to,
Okay.
no, I wasn't trying
Okay.
to draw anything or do stick figures or anything
Got it.
like
Okay.
that. The way
Okay.
some people like, Jim Shooter back when he was a kid and was doing comic books, that what he did. But those are just complete type scripts. None of them survived.
Hmm.
Very little that I did survive. I was able to find a couple of old plots of mine that never got. I think I found the Supergirl plot and what was to have been my the next issue of the Scarecrow, and I posted them online so people would get an idea what a plot that I would give an artist look like to see how detailed it was, so people would get that idea. But that's what the Welcome Back Cotters were. They were all full scripts as opposed to the plots, and they were a lot of fun. I loved doing them. I even put a plug in for my favorite Knish place in Brooklyn, Shotskin's Knishes. I figured Gabe Cotter would mention where he would get his Knishes, so I put
Hmm.
that in there.
I still have the issue, so I'll probably have to look those up again. Um, for me, it seemed rather odd when DC published it because at the time, Gold Key or Whitman or whatever were like the big. That's where TV shows go. Like they did Happy Days and they did, Marvel got a few too, I guess, a Man from Atlantis. But it seems like for the most part, DC didn't do TV adaptations by the late 70s. They were kind of out of it. Was there a reason why what resonated with them to say, hey, let's grab this Welcome Back Cotter? That's a good deal.
Well, since I came in at the end of the run rather than the beginning,
Oh, you don't
I'm
know. Okay,
unaware
I thought
that
maybe somebody might have told you. Yeah.
now. Well, now, Mark Evanier might know, even though he was not writing the comic book back then, I think he was already working on the TV show, so
Yeah.
perhaps he would be aware. That's just a
I
hypothetical.
I can ask him. Yeah.
He might be a
Um.
person to reach out to see,
Yeah.
why in the first. I don't remember who wrote the first issues, and I don't remember who stopped writing the first issues
Yeah.
that I got to write mine.
Yeah.
But all I know is when someone, as I said, "Hey, you want to write Welcome Back, Kotter?" Sure, I love that
Yeah.
TV show.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Whatever
as
you
a
got.
fan, I don't remember who wrote it at all. I hate to say. I remember the artwork and I remember that there's 10 issues and there was one Treasury edition, which I believe just took the leftover material that hadn't been published yet and just to kind of,
Well, I'm
take.
assuming those books are the books where most of the audience paid the least attention to who wrote them, because
Yeah.
a lot of them were what might just be, they hoped, fans of the TV show as opposed to regular
Yeah.
comic book
And that's
readers.
what I was. I mean, I was a kid, I wasn't looking at credits much then.
Particularly not
Yeah.
then.
Yeah.
I mean,
Um,
well, there comes a point when you're a comic book fan that you say, "Hey, I like this artwork more than that artwork."
mhm.
You know,
And
that, "Hey,
yeah,
I
I hate to
like the."
say, you focus on the art versus writers usually first. It's like I'm accustomed to that because I'm a writer myself. And you see the artists always getting all the adulation. So yeah, I get it.
Well, yes, when I remember when I was reading Batman, and you'd say, "Oh, I like the Denny O'Neil Batman story drawn by Neil Adams more than the Batman story." And I don't want to disparage any of the other artists, so I won't name them,
Yeah,
but more than, it's like, gee, same script, but somehow when Neil Adams drew him, and that
yeah. I
was
was
like
gonna
the
say
first.
anybody
Yeah, that
other
was
than
the
Neil
first new
Adams.
version. That was a big
Yeah,
change. So,
yeah, yeah.
so the art mattered. But that's sort of how we first got involved with stuff. We noticed, oh, I like this one better than that one,
Yeah,
or I like when Gil Kane does this, or whatever it happens to be. That's often the first experience we have.
yeah. And that's one thing I noticed. You're mentioning fill-in issues. It's like if somebody did a fill-in issue, that never bothered me. If they became basically the permanent fill-in, then I was like a little more upset. It's like, hey, what happened to the good artist or the good writer that I used to like?
Well, the
Yeah,
difficulty with
that happened.
fill-in issues in
Yeah,
Marvel was the Marvel universe is basically one single continuous story. So
right.
generally, whatever issue the fill-in interrupts, something was ongoing, some story. Even if they wrapped up the villain in that issue, you wanted to find out what's happening in the private life of the character when they're not being a superhero. So it's sort of okay, this was fun, but let's get back to whatever. And plus, I think a lot of the fill-in issues were either Chris Claremont for a while, and then Bill Mantlo became the king of the fill-ins for a while. I don't remember how many dozens of them he
He's the
did.
name I remember. Yes.
Yeah.
um. So you said you left the comic book industry in 1979. Was Time Warp like the last series you worked on? That sounds about
Well, it's not
like
really
that.
a
But
series. It was more Time Warp was like House of Mystery except for science fiction. So it was
yeah, yeah.
basically I was just doing a lot of one-off pitches, and then I went to the Clarion Science Fiction Arts Workshop, and after that I stopped doing that because I was thinking, well, I'm selling my story to a comic book company and they own it forever, but if I sell it somewhere else, then I own it, and every time it gets reprinted, I get money. And
Right.
nowhere can that be better illustrated than I was contacted by a TV show called Tales from the Dark Side, wanting to adapt a story of mine into a script. Tales from the Dark Side was a show like The Twilight Zone that was in the mid to late 80s.
Yeah.
And there was a story I wrote for Tales from the Unexpected, I think, called My Ghost Rider the Vampire, about a very bad horror novelist who becomes a bestseller after he digs up a vampire and has him tell him all the stories, incorporates them into the book, and then gets full of himself, and the vampire gets jealous, and there's a whole thing that goes on. Anyway, it got adapted into an episode of The Tales from the Dark Side, but DC owned it, not me.
Yeah.
So DC kindly gave me a piece of the money, but they got paid most of the money. Luckily, I ended up then doing a couple episodes on my own, and I got all the money.
That's cool.
But that's what happened with that particular one. So I've just been working on science fiction, fantasy, and horror fiction on my own, published in magazines like Analog and Lightspeed and others, and
Yeah.
uh, and working for the Sci-Fi Channel for about 13 and a half years, editing their websites and that other science fiction magazine. So I've been sort of working editorial day jobs so I can write whatever the heck I want to write on my own. I've been nominated for the Bram Stoker Award 8 times. I lost all 8 times, so I'm 0 and 8. I'm Susan Lucci. I'm others have lost more, but no one has lost more without having won. So I consider myself the Susan Lucci of the Bram Stoker Awards of the Horror Writers Association. So that's where my career has been. In the last 8.5 years, I've been doing my own podcast, interviewing writers about how they write their stuff. I've got 238 episodes live so far over the last 8.5 years. So
Wow,
that's
you're up to almost to the level I am.
what number are
This
you up to?
this will be 287, something like
Wow.
that.
And how
Yeah.
when was your first episode?
2018. So
Okay.
I'm almost every week. I think the
Well, yeah,
first
so you're doing this.
yeah.
See, my podcast I can't do every week because my podcast involves eating a full meal. I
Oh,
take I take people out for a meal. We record while we're having the meal. It's called Eating the Fantastic.
oh
And
wow.
I
Okay.
and so hopefully people are relaxed and forget they're even doing a podcast. We just sort of sit down
Interesting.
and clip on lapel mics and just chat, and it ends whenever the check comes. Unlike this, which ends whenever you say it's over,
Yeah.
it ends when the check gets paid, and I say, okay, well the check gets paid. So if the service is fast, we're out of here quick, and
Yeah.
if the service is slow, we talk a little longer, and
Yeah.
it's like you're sitting at the table with us while we're having a meal.
Well, my shows are usually 60 to 90 minutes roughly,
Yeah.
so we're almost coming up to the 60-minute mark. But I've done shorter shows, I've done longer shows. If it's too long, I break it up into parts. But anyway, um and then this podcast, we're doing comic books today, but I talk about TV, movies, animation, music, and I've written books on all those subjects. So, and I'm interested in all that stuff. So that's why I bring people on like you.
Yeah. Well,
So
and I can, as you can tell, I can ramble on forever, but
that's
how
good.
much of it depends on cra or fits with crazy or whatever your mandate is. It's
Yep.
funny. I was at the Baltimore Comic Con back in 2021, and Jim Steranko was being interviewed, and I can't remember the name of the poor guy who was doing the interview, but the guy asked the first question, and then I eventually realized Jim is talking and talking and talking and talking. And I said, I wonder when the guy's going to be able to ask a second question. And he didn't get in a second question until 48 minutes in.
Wow.
That's how long, because Jim was just going from one anecdote to another. So then I escaped from a Ferris wheel. I was in a straitjacket upside down. I got the handcuffs. And then it was onto this now. Because Jim is fascinating. I could talk
Hmm.
to Jim, doesn't need the interview. He could have just, him like Carl Nelson, could have stood up and just talk spontaneously for 2 hours on his own. So I felt bad for the guy. Will the guy get to ask the second question? The guy just sitting there, and
Yeah.
eventually Jim, I guess, paused, and the guy got in another question. But
I've tried to get
I'm
him.
afraid.
I've tried to get him on here. I've actually had dinner with Jim Stranko, but he told me, and if he's been on other podcasts, well, oh well. But the line he told me is, he says, "I can't do your podcast, Mark, because then I'd have to do everybody's podcast." And I said, "No, you don't. You just do mine."
Yeah.
But I understand it. He's highly sought after for his wisdom and his interviews and his talents. So I get it. But I'd love to have him
Well,
on the show. Anyway,
maybe I'll try him someday because you see what my guest got out of being on the show is a free meal.
there we go.
So if I say, look, Jim, I'll take you to a nice steakhouse and buy a good bottle of wine, and we'll have the
And
conversation then. Maybe that will convince him. I'll have
and
to
he might
try
do
that
it.
the
And
next Baltimore Comic Con.
tell him I promise not to ask him to have him on my podcast if he does yours. So I'll live vicariously through you.
I would love to, and I'm almost tempted to. I have something that he autographed for me at my very first comic book convention in 1970, and I am tempted, even though he has lines and even though he charges for autographs, I am tempted to get him to re-autograph it. The Jim Steranko portfolio that was in 1970 that was for sale. I
Hmm.
also have an autographed copy of the History of Comics that he did that I bought
Hmm.
at the very
Right.
first convention that he didn't have at the first convention. I paid $1 for it and it was mailed to me like a month or two later. I still have the envelope that has my name
Cool.
on it. But so it would just be interesting having him re-autograph something that he autographed. At this point, it would be 54 years ago if he did it at this
Does
coming
he need
year.
to re-autograph it because the original one faded out, or what? You
No,
just
no,
want him to
no, it'd
sign
just
it
be
again?
funny to have an autograph
Oh, I
dated
see. Just to have him
1970 and
sign it again.
an
Okay, I
autograph
get it.
dated 2024 would just be an interesting who has something like that.
Right.
Uh, yeah. Well, the one thing I ever autographed at that distance, there's a writer named Jack Williamson. He lived to be 98 and three quarters. He was a mentor to me. He published and I was going to see him in 2003, which I realized was the 75th anniversary of the first story he had published.
Wow.
And I thought, how often can you get something to autograph something 75 years after he published it? So I had to watch on eBay to buy a copy of Astounding Stories that I could have him sign. And here, silly me, I'm saying astounding, and I've got it on the wall. It's hidden back there. Astounding versus
Yeah.
amazing. I feel embarrassed that I'm misremembering it. I think it was amazing. It
Mm,
was amazing.
that's okay.
Uh, but to walk up to somebody and say, recognize this.
Mhm.
But so I think I paid $100 to get a copy of this pulp magazine from 1928, and he signed it on the 75th anniversary of when he published it. So, because who does
Very
that? For me to have to for you to have me sign something on the 75th anniversary of when it was published, it would have to be I'd have to be 95 years old
well.
because the
I'll hold on to this and have you sign
yeah, or
it.
Dead of Night number 11. Dead of Night number 11, my first comic book was published in 1975. I'd have to be, that's going to be impossible. I'll try. I'll do my best.
All right, all right.
Let's make a date and get together for that. No.
I won't be much younger. I mean, it's like, I mean, I might be a little bit younger now, but it's like if you're 95, I'm like gonna be old too. So anyway,
Yeah, I got 2 years
uh,
on. I mean, I was born in 55, so
yeah, and I was in 66, so it's like there we go. So if you're 95, I'm gonna be 80 something.
yeah,
Anyway, but we'll plan it in the future.
we'll make a date. Yeah,
All right. Well, I don't really have any other questions. As it's just basically, Mark and I have tried to reach out to various people who worked at Crazy or had something to do with Crazy. I mean, obviously you did with this, and I did interviews years ago. I did 2 books on Crack Magazine, and then I recently did 2 books on Mad Magazine. So I interviewed people. Some are gone now that applied for this book, and some of the Mad ones. Some of those people came from Crazy, and so I got to. So we just want a well-rounded picture of what Marvel was doing back then
yeah.
from 73 to 83. So
So who did you get to chat with at Crack? Did you get to interview John Severin and people
I
like that?
interviewed his wife, and the reason why is because she's passed away too. At the time, he was working on a Batlash miniseries. This is like 2009, 2010. And she goes, "Well, I know all the stuff about John anyway. He doesn't know anything. He just draws." And she said this about him. And I said, "Fine." But she did explain his situation at Cracked at the time, which was that he was on a separate salary. Everything was separate for him. He could do as many pages as he wanted. So, and he took advantage of that. There's one issue of Cracked where he literally did every page of the book except for the subscription page, which had a Bill Ward reprint picture on
Oh,
it. And but yeah, he could do as many pages or as few pages as he wanted to. He was, like I said, he was on a salary, and so people who ask, "Well, why didn't he go back to Mad after blah blah blah?" And it's like, well, he had a sweet deal at Cracked,
yeah.
so he
Oh, I
didn't.
loved his work there. Yeah.
Yeah, so and he wasn't especially fond of Al Feldstein at the time, and he did have a falling out at one point with Kurtzman as well. So, and it's like, yeah. And then by the time Feldstein retired, I mean, he was, Cracked was almost over anyway. So, he lasted a few more years. So he just stuck it out. So there
Yeah,
you go.
well, I guess there are a lot of people. Kurtzman would have a lot of falling outs with people, but were you saying Kurtzman or Feldstein? No,
Well,
Feldstein had a
Feldstein you
falling.
never got along with. That's why you never see Severin in like Weird Science or something.
Yeah.
Besides it not really being in his wheelhouse science fiction, but it's like or even in the horror books, you never saw a Severin horror story either. It's like he always stuck with the two-fisted tails and the frontline combat and that type of stuff. The stuff that Feldstein didn't edit. So, you know, there you go. Um,
Interesting.
and it was never formally like they never said I hate that guy, but you could tell that there's a icy, and it was both ways. I don't think Feldstein was very fond of Severin either, so I don't know if it was personal or if it was professional reason. We'll never know now. So
Well, one of my proudest moments was I got to present, though he could not be physically present at the time. I guess Al Feldstein wasn't, was health couldn't travel. The Horror Eyes Association gave Al Feldstein a Lifetime Achievement Award
mm,
for horror, for all the horror books he did, and I got to give a speech about his importance
mhm,
to horror and all the, and then somebody had turned off the lights and things like that. And
yeah,
his wonderful stuff. So I was proud of that. And also, one of the magazines that published a science fiction story of mine had an Al Feldstein science fictional cover on it.
mhm.
So when I got to meet him at San Diego Comic Con, I got to say, hey, I'm so thrilled. My favorite part of being in that magazine was you got to do the dinosaur cover with rocket ships on it and everything. So I had a lovely conversation with him one year and took a photo with him. So
Yeah.
he
I
was,
I liked Al Feldstein. I could understand he was a tough editor, and that's part of the reason why a lot of them didn't like him. Some of the Mad guys liked him, but the ones that tended to like him tended to not be ones from the comic book industry. They were ones from like the advertise, like a Bob Clark or somebody like that. They tended to like Feldstein because I think is because he was very um he knew what he wanted. He stuck with the deadlines and everything like that. And you
Well,
know,
and when you were paying about 10 times and more than a comic book page, I think at one point they were paying what, 800 to 1,000 a page and more,
I think so.
when
Yeah,
the
yeah,
regular comic book companies were paying artists $50 a page or something like
yeah.
that. So that was like the highest paid work anybody
And you
could
had the
get.
circulation too. I mean, at one point, this peaked $2
Two
million.
and a half million or
Yeah,
something.
something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah. So I
It
mean,
was in the, I know it was in the top 10. It was up there with TV Guide and Playboy and things like that at one
yeah,
point.
yeah. So
But how the
it's
mighty have fallen. It's
yes, and now they're all basically a reprint book. So it's like at least it's around, but I wish they'd come back to new material. But crazy, they did a trade paperback about 5 or 6 years ago, but they just reprinted all the superhero related material and kind of ignored like all the TV and movie parodies and stuff. And it's like, okay, whatever. I'd like to have a nice crazy omnibus. I think some of that would be funny to
oh, of
readjust.
everything. Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah. At the very least, the Wolfman and Gerber issues. At the very most, the entire run. But hey,
Yeah. Hey, well, I'm the kind of guy who gets upset that they're not reprinting letter pages and comics ads when they do these reprints of the comics. I want
yeah,
them
I like the letters
complete.
pages too. Yeah, because it kind of gives you a sense of what was going on at the time, what people were concerned about, or happy about, or upset about, or whatever. It wasn't just here we're reading this story again. I even like the reprints. They're doing the facsimile editions that have all the original advertising and stuff like
Yeah.
that. I'm glad they're doing stuff like that.
Yeah, when I was doing a reread of Marvel at one point, and I guess I was doing it online with some kind of Marvel Unlimited or Comixology or something like that, and they did have all the letter columns. So
Mhm.
you can't really see the history of Marvel Comics unless you're chronologically reading all the letter columns
Yeah.
as they're slowly figuring out what to do. And should we have letter columns, or should we just have one letter column in one magazine for all the books? They were actually theorizing that within the first year. Do we want to waste a page? Things
Mhm.
like that. So to see it coming together and the universe forming, you need the letter columns to do that, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I used to enjoy the letter columns, and uh, it is funny in some of these magazines going back to Crazy and stuff like that and Cracked, because of the audience. A lot of the letters were made up and written by you mentioned Duffy Voland. He was one of the writers. There was a Crazy Super Special Annual that Marv Wolfman oversaw from 1975, but there's brand new letters pages. But I found out that Duffy Voland and a couple other people actually wrote those letters. They weren't written by
Huh.
the, the audience, as it were. So anyway, things you things you learn when you do research on this stuff. So anyway,
Well, as I said, they got everybody to do everything back then.
yeah.
If you were there and had a pulse and had a little bit of a sense of humor, and everybody there was sort of with it and witty, you got some work out of them other than what your normal job that you got paid for.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of cool. You got to have a little fun. It wasn't just all workaday drudgery or something like that, just slaving at a desk. You got to do a few different things.
No, we did not want to go home. We would, go out to dinner with each other and go to the movies together and play poker with each other and softball and hang out on the weekends. It was definitely not not a 9 to 5 job.
All right. Well, that's all the questions I really have. At this point, I just wanted you to give like a plug of your website again, any books you want to plug, any appearances you have, or if you're showing up to any conventions or anything, or your podcast again.
Well, if you go to scottedelman.com, SCOTTEDELMAN.com, you'll find links to everything, to my short fiction, to the books that I have, my most recent collections, Things That Never Happened is a collection of my horror stories. What We Still Talk About is a collection of my science fiction stories. And a lot of my fiction you'll find links to are online. These days, there are a lot of online publications where you can just go and not buy anything. So if you search on Scott Edelman and Lightspeed or Scott Edelman and Apex, you'll find the stories I published there. And my podcast, Eating the Fantastic, go to eatingthefantastic.com or just search on Podlink and Eating the Fantastic, and it'll show 15 or 20 different places you can download it from.
Hmm.
Lots of comic book people, but it's a mix: science fiction, fantasy, horror. comics. I have, new writers and old. I have, as late as 89-year-old William F. Nolan, who wrote Logan's Run and Twilight Zone episodes, and Larry
Wow.
Lieber, who at the time was 88 and co-created Thor, Ant-Man, and Iron Man,
Mhm.
to people, just starting out and publishing their first novel or first comic work. Most recent comic book interview I did was with Dan Parent, who'd worked for Archie for
Wow.
35 years, and he was a fun interview.
Mhm.
And just pick someone who go look at the list of who appeared on the 238 episode. Don't start at the beginning. Just find someone you're familiar with and see if that suits you.
Very cool. Okay. Well, thank you, Scott, for being my special guest, and pleasure talking to you about all these different things at Marvel and DC and things like that, science fiction. And I
Thanks for
appreciate.
having me and good luck with the crazy book. I look forward to reading it when
All
it
right.
comes out.
Hopefully, it'll come out. It'll probably come out next year, but we're trying to get it all done this year. But the way things go, I get it done this year, but it'll be next year.
Yeah. Well, it takes a
So,
while to get through the
yep,
system.
yep. But anyway, again, thank you. And again, this is Scott Edelman is my special guest, and I want to just thank him again. And this is Mark Arnold for the Fun Ideas podcast, and we will see you next time.